It is now my pleasure to introduce our final speaker for tonight's event, Dr. Paul Swan. Paul is AWAC's Sustainable Project Manager and is a very well-respected identity within the global wool sector. It is a pleasure to have him supporting this campaign with his presentation this evening. Paul will give us an overview of clip preparation and testing services, selling and handling systems, and product assurance mechanisms, such as the National Wool Declaration and the Sustainable Integrity Scheme. I'll now invite Paul to share his screen. The Q&A session will follow the same format as the previous two sessions. I think we're about to see Paul's screen. We are now seeing Paul's screen now. I can see that. So it's over to you, Paul. Mute your computer, Paul.
G'day, well spotted.
There we go. Thank you, Paul.
Okay. Look, it's a privilege to be a part of the launch of Trust in Australian Wool. My task for the next 7 minutes is to present a high-level summary of Australia's wool handling and assurance systems. And I'll do that. I'll keep it brief. It's actually a great story. It's a story of innovation. Australia, over the past 2 centuries, has quietly revolutionised how we take the wool off the sheep, how we package it, how we transact it. Now, starting back in, I think, 1890 with the invention of the overhead gear by, I think it was Herb Austin and Frank Woolsey. Then to Christian Kurtz's invention of the forerunner of the modern wool press in 1897. And then in 1909, for example, the invention by David Unipon of the reciprocating wool handpiece. The systems by which we harvest wool, pack it in bales and ship it around the place have changed. Over the succeeding 100 years, what were initially great ideas, practice changes, have become standards, operating standards that have been codified in our industry. So some of the examples I'll give you are the standards that exist now that are maintained by the Australian Wool Exchange for the standard of the packs that we pack the wool in. These standards specify a low contaminant risk bale of a particular dimension, a particular material quality. These simple standards actually underpin our efficient logistics systems and by inference, systems like this around the world. A second major development has been in the area of codifying our high wool clip preparation standards. Again, in a scheme managed by AWAC, Australia has a national code of best practice for how the wool should be classed in the shearing shed and the lines that are prepared. AWAC monitors this, maintains this standard, monitors the scheme, and it trains or it accredits our 16,000 wool classes around the country. And finally, we've also codified even the labelling for the wool packs. But all these systems are now going through a digitisation transformation to help with the logistics and the quality of information flow from farm through into the pipeline. An area, it's a history that we've been quite proud of, and it has influenced systems like this around the world. The next area where there's been a huge wave of innovation is in ensuring the quality of our wool objectively. Now, originally, wool buyers used to value wool using their hands and their eyes. Individual wool packs would be opened. The buyers would have to reach in and assess the quality of wool and form a value judgment. Buy the wool, and then someone would have to pack the wool back into the pack and seal it. Very labour consuming. Back in 1970, the Australian wool industry embarked on a 30-year innovation campaign called the Australian Objective Measurement Project. This system developed and I guess refined systems for example, taking core and grab samples from sealed bales, as you can see in that photo. We also developed the system for displaying that grabbed wool so that buyers could quickly and efficiently assess the value of the wool. But we developed systems for appraising what was in the wool display sample for the standards and typing. In Australia, and you might not realise this, but every sale lot of wool offered at auction is appraised independently for its style and wool classing standards. But perhaps most importantly, what's happened is Australia has contributed very significantly to a revolution, or the establishment of a currency, if you like, in the global wool trade, which is called objective measurement, backed by IWTO test certificates. And examples on the screen from the Australian Wool Testing Authority. This language, this currency, represents decades of investment and patient refinement, international certification standards. And it's been a great achievement by a lot of people and a lot of countries to get to this point, but especially Australia. However, this is not a set of laurels to rest on, because innovation and the need to improve our specifications doesn't stand still. The next wave of innovation has been washing through our industry, whether here or abroad, and it's basically declaring the ethical qualities of wool, the ethical or stewardship practices. From consumers wanting to buy free-range eggs or sustainable fashion to wear around their houses. All of us, all industries are dealing with demand to supply traceability, provenance, and a sustainable product. The wool industry is no different. We commenced our journey over 10 years ago, nearly 15 years ago, in the development of what we now call the National Wool Declaration. And what I'm showing you here on the screen is a standard wool classes specification. The National Wool Declaration section is highlighted in blue. That section, which originally was created to declare the risk of wool contamination in our clip and to help manage that, in 2008, had an important addition which allowed our growers to declare whether the sheep in the mob had been mulesed and if they'd been treated with pain relief, or if no mulesing had occurred. This system, which we call the National Wool Declaration, underpins the specification of this non-mulesing status or mulesing status in the Australian wool clip. Close to 80% of Australian wool growers voluntarily complete this declaration, the National Wool Declaration component. But one thing I want to point out to you with this declaration, and it's comprehensiveness. On this single form, we have the details for the wool grower, we have the details of the wool classer, the individual property and its identification code, the mobs of sheep, and the bales of wool, the individual bales of wool which came from those mobs. I'll just highlight two particular components. You'll see on the bottom right, the 8-digit unique property identification code. This is a link to the National Livestock Production Assurance Scheme and the National Livestock Identification Scheme. And at the top left, we have the wool class's unique 6-digit identification code and accreditation code. Now, these elements in this simple form, which is completed in wool sheds around Australia every day of the week, allow us to create a linkage from farm through into the pipeline at the level of the bale. It's a very powerful system that is now undergoing its own digital transformation. But again, we can't stop there. What's happening now is that the industry is now moving from specifying things like mulesing as our definition of ethical practices to what we call farm stewardship. Ultimately, this is about connecting consumers who care about farm stewardship to farmers who can demonstrate it. It builds on the excellent foundations of the National Wool Declaration and the Code of Practice and the implicit harvesting and clip preparation standards and traceability and so on. And what it adds is a comprehensive suite of farm operations and the standards being applied, including sheep health and welfare, environment chemicals, transport, social responsibility, and the like. The sustainable program that I have the privilege to manage is one example of these stewardship certification schemes. Sustainable itself was established in the wool industry in 2015, and it has grown. We have over 1,000 active farms participating in the scheme voluntarily, and those farmers produce around 10% of Australia's merino production. As I said, it's only one of the schemes. Into this important space, there are other certification schemes like the Textile Exchange's Responsible Wool Standard, New Zealand Merino's ZQ system, or Schneider Group's Authentico program, amongst many others. These sustainability or stewardship declaration systems should be seen for what they are, and that is a tremendous opportunity for our industry. It's also the next wave of innovation and doing what we really do need to do to connect our farmers who care through to consumers who would like to invest in their products particularly. To wrap this presentation up, just to conclude, what I wanted to say was that unbeknownst to many in the world and in the wool industry, Australia has had a really leading role to play in revolutionising the way that we harvest, pack, specify and transact wool around the world. It's a great story to tell. It's a story of taking ownership of your qualities. It's a story of caring about what your customer needs. However, it's a journey that's not over. And the next major wave of innovation is washing through our industry. That wave of innovation is about specifying stewardship. It's about traceability and certification standards. At the end of the day, the last decades of innovation that we've had and investment in our future and the ones to come are simply about engendering trust between the producer and the buyer, engendering trust in Australian wool. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot for that, Paul. We've got one question here and we are running a little behind, so I think this will be the only one, but how do you see sustainable being different from the many other certification schemes? Do you think there is a risk of confusing consumers with the many schemes that are currently available?
Look, it's a great question. What I would say is that there is definitely a risk of confusing consumers. There's also a huge risk of causing inefficiency in our pipeline, because if you stand in the shoes of spinners and top makers and knitters, having multiple parallel overlapping schemes can lead to duplicated inventory, confusion, additional costs, duplicated certification processes. So this is something that is a challenge we as an industry collectively need to grasp. I have the privilege of chairing a process internationally which seeks to address this issue. And it's something that I'm very confident that we'll be able to do quickly. Because at the end of the day, we have to ensure that the people that really benefit are the people who pay for all this. On the first hand, that's the consumer, but also at the other end of the day, it's the growers, whether here in Australia or in other countries. So it's an opportunity we should grasp, and it's a challenge we shouldn't shy from.
Thanks for that, Paul.